Thank you, Stu, and good evening all. I'm very grateful for the honor of reporting some welcome surprises in the global energy revolution that is taking us to a carbon-neutral future. And I want to start by inviting you to hold these two seemingly contradictory thoughts at the same time. Both true. Another aspect of this duality is that climate science models conservatively understate the speed and the runaway potential of climate change, but models of climate choices and consequences, at least as conservatively, understate what we can do to slow, stop, and reverse climate change. Offsetting these two contrary biases, the race of our lives, as Jeremy Grantham calls it, is very much on. The outcome is up to us, and despair and complacency are equally unwarranted. We do well to take General Eisenhower's wise advice to make tough problems soluble by expanding their boundaries to encompass more options and more synergies so they include whatever the solution requires. All four sectors that use energy, that is transport, buildings, industry, and electricity, save more energy faster together than separately. All four kinds of innovation, not just technology but also design, not only public policy but also new business strategy, can combine to create deeply disruptive game changers while the old industries are still putting on their boots. And that's what's happening now. Ford's auto industry, Edison's electricity industry, and Rockefeller's oil industry changed the world. If Ford and Edison took a very long nap on one of their car camping holidays together and woke up and saw their businesses today, they would recognize almost everything except the electronics. Yet their industries face vast disruptions as 21st century technology and speed collide head-on with 20th and even 19th century institutions, rules, and cultures. And now the first two of these three great industries, autos and electricity, are coming together to eat the third one, oil. As we might imagine, Ford mischievously muttering to Edison, "Let's see what happens when electricity replaces gasoline. Then those electric cars add flexibility and cheap distributed storage and make batteries cheap for all, helping the grid to integrate variable solar and wind power so distributed renewable power replaces giant fossil-fueled or nuclear stations, and the fossil fuels go away." Now, the story really starts, as it always should, with using energy more productively. In the past 47 years, saved U.S. energy, about 2/3 due to smarter technologies, has dropped total energy use from that curve to this curve. It's decreased total energy use per dollar of GDP so far by 61%, with immense cumulative savings, a fuel not burned. Renewables, meanwhile, have doubled, nearly tripled, but with 27 times less cumulative impact. The ratio of headlines and awareness is the opposite, because renewables are visible on the skyline, on the rooftop, but energy is invisible, and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. And yet saved energy is half of the world's historic decarbonization and at least half of future decarbonization. And the savings are of two main kinds. One way is to save fossil fuels by substituting electricity or by making it more efficiently by the means shown in three columns. Let's start on the left. At the upper left, the huge conversion losses in red at thermal power stations are eliminated at the lower left when solar and wind power in green generate electricity directly without using a steam cycle. In the middle column, fuel combustion at the top provides heat several-fold less efficiently than a renewably powered heat pump that concentrates at the bottom free low-temperature heat from the environment. And in the right column, gasoline and diesel engines, with their big losses in red, are far less efficient than renewably powered motors at the bottom in battery electric vehicles. So the systems in the lower row, replacing fossil fuels with renewable electricity, are several-fold more efficient in turning that renewable electricity into delivered services. But this does not yet include higher efficiency in the equipment being powered, or the building being heated, or the vehicle being moved. First, raising that end-use efficiency, the kind I will emphasize today, makes the heat pumps and the electric vehicle batteries smaller, cheaper, and less mineral intensive. Upstream efficiency then combines with that end-use efficiency to form a combination called primary energy efficiency. And by that crude metric, in 1975, U.S. government and industry all insisted that the energy needed to make $1 of GDP could not go down. A year later, in the article Stu just mentioned, I heretically suggested that it could drop 72% in the next 50 years. So far, it's dropped 61% in 47 years. Yet, just the innovations already made by 2010 can save another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at a third the real cost. And 13 years later, that's looking conservative, because optimizing buildings, vehicles, and factories as whole systems, not as piles of little isolated parts, can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into increasing returns. And vigorously applied, that integrative design could quintuple global energy efficiency or productivity by around 2060, triple it by probably 2040, as documented in this foundational peer-reviewed paper. Making energy savings several-fold bigger like that could actually cost less, because it uses not more but fewer devices. It doesn't add stuff, it designs stuff out, and it doesn't use fancier but simpler devices, more artfully chosen, combined, timed, and sequenced. We're more familiar with resources like copper ore bodies or oil reservoirs, finite and depletable assemblages of atoms. In contrast, energy efficiency resources are infinitely expandable assemblages of ideas, depleting only stupidity, a very abundant resource. Let me give you a few examples. My wife Judy and I live 7,100 feet up in the Colorado Rocky Mountains near Aspen, where temperatures used to dip to minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The central atrium, seen here in a February snowstorm, has so far produced 81 passive solar banana crops. And our house helped inspire several 100,000 European passive buildings with no heating and roughly normal construction cost. An analog in Bangkok, very hot and muggy, saved 90% of the air conditioning energy with better comfort and normal construction cost. Nearly everyone on Earth lives in a climate between those of Bangkok and Old Snowmass. And the reason, of course, that the capital cost doesn't go up, and in our house it went down a little bit, is that we saved more construction costs leaving out the heating system than we paid extra for the efficiency that got rid of the heating system. But wherever you live, integrative design gives many benefits from each expenditure. So in the upper middle photo, the white arch at the top has 12 different functions, but it has only one cost. Such integrative design let our Empire State Building retrofit save 38, later 43% of the energy with a 3-year payback. 3 years later, our cost-effective retrofit in Denver saved 70%, making this half-century-old federal complex more efficient than what was then the best new U.S. office, which in turn is only a third as efficient as RMI's, Rocky Mountain Institute's, net positive, no mechanicals, passive office. That uses about a ninth the normal amount of energy in the coldest North American climate zone. Now there's a Bavarian building reportedly using 2/5 less energy than that. And yet all these technologies existed over a decade ago. What's mainly improved is not so much technology as design, how we put the pieces together. And it keeps improving. The Empire State Building's owner aims to redouble the savings to about 80%. Let me go back to the fourth example here, RMI's Innovation Center, which, as far as we know, is the most efficient in the two coldest climate zones of North America. It's a building designed to last 100 years and keeps people cool by 11 methods and warm by 10 methods, all of them passive. None of them involves blowing hot or cold air at you. The methods include hyperchairs whose built-in 4 watts of silent fans and 14 watts of electric car seat heaters can keep you comfortable if the room is between 64 and 86 degrees F, although in fact it's kept within a degree or two of 70. My favorite part of that building is the 260 square foot Nega Mechanicals room, where I want to sneak in some night and outline on the floor in yellow industrial tape like bodies at a crime scene, where the boilers and chillers were supposed to go before we designed them out and took the space back. We expect this building's cost premium and under a 4-year payback would drop to about 0 with wider experience, as it did for Germany's better passive buildings. In fact, in Europe, industrializing mass retrofits to net zero energy and streamlining their finance and soft costs is now getting cheap enough to finance entirely from saved energy, while extending building life and improving amenity, health, and value. This whole retrofit has even been demonstrated in the UK to be installable in a single day while you're off at work. And it involves basically bolting on a prefabbed tea cozy around your house and dropping in a super insulated solar roof that produces as much energy as the building uses over the year. Now, the state of the art evolved by the passive industry has progressed greatly. The best cost-effective retrofits, like the North German examples in the upper right, are now 12 to 17 times more efficient than the post-war German norm at the upper left. Making the whole building stock that good will occupy Germany's skilled builders for the next couple of generations. But of course, if you super outsolate instead of super insulating with all the craft labor at the lower right, it gets a lot faster and cheaper. 9 standard old apartment houses in Brooklyn have just been super outsulated to save 80% of their energy without disturbing the occupants. Even in tropical climates, traditional building design can keep you feeling about 29 to 34 Fahrenheit degrees cooler, and the big mechanical space cooling systems can be at least tripled in efficiency, all with excellent economics. But a revolutionary experiment that some Princeton scientists did 4 years ago revealed a startling alternative. Purely radiative cooling kept people comfortable outdoors in Singapore in this shaded but open-ended pavilion like a bus stop shelter without moving, drying, or cooling the air. Instead, the people stayed cool just by radiating their bodies' far infrared rays into panels circulating slightly cooled water and shielded from the humid air by a thin plastic film. So radiant temperatures in the mid-70s of degrees F in the panel could deliver comfort in air up to at least 90 degrees at 80% relative humidity. Well, that mild a cooling in the panel could often be done passively with no electricity, potentially about eliminating the world's growth in peak electricity demand. So I've got a Stanford class now working on, can we design this to be so vernacular and so cheap that it could be retrofitted into 1 billion odd slum dwellings and apartments all over the tropics. About indoors, well, this Swiss fist-sized heat pump can deliver 6 to 15 units of hot water per unit of electricity, not just 2 or 3 like a normal heat pump. This Swiss electric cooking system uses vacuum-insulated pots and other innovations to cook better with 2 to 4.5 times less electricity than induction cooktops. Industry uses half the world's energy and electricity. My team's latest $60-odd billion worth of industrial redesigns typically found 30 to 60% energy savings retrofitting old factories, paying back in a few years and far outperforming the brown zone in the upper left corner where most energy service companies deliver disintegrated design. And in new factories, we generally found 40 to 90+% energy savings with lower than normal capital cost. How can you do that? Well, for example, just better pipe and duct design can save 80 to 90-odd% of friction and therefore pumping power, 97% in my house. If everyone did this, it could save roughly half the world's coal-fired electricity, and you'd get your money back typically in less than a year in retrofit or instantly in new build. And yet this isn't in any standard engineering textbook, official study, industry forecast, or climate model. Why not? Because it's not a technology. It's a design method, and few people yet think of design as a way to make things big fast. To wring out friction, we simply use big pipes and small pumps, not small pipes and big pumps. You'll notice also that the little blue pump on the right, is so small it looks like somebody slipped a decimal point, is raised up to meet the pipe rather than the standard method of dipping the pipe down to meet a pump on the floor and back up with 4 right-angle bends. Then to eliminate any remaining elbows and their friction, we lay out the pipes first, then the equipment. So those tan chillers that used to be in a straight row have been staggered until the bends go away. And we lay out the supply pipes as if they were drains. We bend minds, not pipes. We can also save industrial energy by saving the energy-intensive materials that industry makes. A couple of papers I published 2 years ago showed how smarter structural design can profitably save at least half the world's cement and steel that now release 15% of the CO2 in the world. That's not counting another twofold gain from better specification and application, that is, getting the right mix in your concrete and not slopping it around the job site. So together, those approaches could save 3/4 of the concrete before we adopt any lower carbon materials or production processes. But what does better structural design look like? Well, a couple of examples. You can substitute tension for compression structures. Typically, that will look better, cost less, and use about 1/8 as many tons. Pouring concrete into curvy fabric forms, not rigid prismatic forms, can often save over half the concrete by putting strength and stiffness only where you need them. And then the weight savings multiply, they compound because you need less strength to hold up less weight. An airy 3D printed bridge can carry mainly its users, while massive concrete bridges support mainly their own weight. By the way, here's a 3D printed stainless steel bridge. Most importantly, floor slabs are about half the total weight of a typical mid or high-rise building, but a 2-inch thick folded concrete floor slab like corrugated cardboard or a shallow vaulted dome can replace a foot-thick flat slab and cost less and save 3/4 of the cement and all of the steel. And then when you have thin floor slabs, that plus better energy design can save a further roughly 15% of the core structural materials and 3/4 of the energy in a new mid or high-rise building like the Singapore one at the upper right, while increasing the net rentable space by a stunning 55%. How? You just design out the vertical yard of mechanical plenum at each story, as you see at the far left, and then with thin floor slabs, you can let 3 stories with normal 9-foot 2-inch ceiling height, 2.8 meters, fit into the current height of 2 stories. cost and complexity and time all fall dramatically. Why would you build any other way? So how much electricity will the U.S. or the world need? Well, no one knows, even within a factor 2 to 4. The high standard projections risk major overbuilding and stranded assets, and that risk is rising with the obvious trends plus further innovation. For example, in 2021, efficient structural design emerged as a major opportunity I just mentioned to save steel and cement. In 2022, so did low temperature ways to make those materials, like electrochemical iron making at 140 degrees F, like a cup of hot coffee, instead of 2,900 degrees F. In 2023, geological hydrogen became credible. So, what comes next? We're rapidly moving into a tricky period when we need not just deployment, but also discernment about how much of what supply we will actually need, what is a climate-effective investment, and what is a shiny object with a slick sales pitch. Meanwhile, of course, full speed ahead on both efficiency and renewables, because the end game details needn't constrain our opening moves. Even without integrated design or those other innovations, U.S. electricity use could shrink 25% by 2050, despite all-electric autos and a 2.6-fold bigger GDP. So this quadrupled electric efficiency would save kilowatt hours at a cost just 1/10 the price of the electricity we're saving. So we should have bought much more efficiency than shown here. This makes you wonder, what can advanced energy efficiency do in developing countries? Well, in this 27-watt electric household, Berkeley Lab uses solar panels a third smaller than shown in the picture to power 7,000 lux of LED lights, a mobile phone charger, a clock radio, a table fan, and a 22-inch color television. And their super high efficiencies cut total capital cost by half, empowering twice as many off-grid families for the same money and enabling cheap and very reliable DC solar microgrids. And if you invest to make things that save electricity rather than to supply more, you'll need roughly 1,000-fold less capital, and you'll recover it 10 times faster. Lower capital intensity and higher capital velocity combine, so you need about 10,000 times less capital for the most capital-intensive sector, electricity, which devours about a fourth of global development capital. Freeing up that capital to fund other development needs is the most powerful economic lever we know for development. Just buy negawatts, save watts whenever they're cheaper than megawatts, and reward the providers for cutting your bill, not for selling you more energy. Efficiency is most vital for the billion people with no electricity, but little prospect of getting or affording grid electricity on a typical family income of $2 a day or less. So they use kerosene lamps that kill 4 million people a year. They would rank 8th among nations in carbon emissions, and they burn about $38 billion worth of kerosene a year. That's a fifth of the total cost of global lighting, to deliver very inefficiently just 1,000th of the world's light. But now we can banish darkness so daughters and sons can learn to read. An entrepreneurial village woman can sell or lease an integrated photovoltaic LED lithium battery smart chip lighting package, like that yellow device at the upper right called a Waka Waka, Swahili for shines brightly. It pays back in weeks to months against kerosene. It can be microfinanced by scratch cards or via the smartphone it recharges. And eliminating kerosene is like a perpetual annuity equal to a month's extra income each year for that household. So which of these offerings is more exciting and lucrative and transformational? To which of these strategies would you entrust your company's fate, your portfolio's performance, and our common future? The same whole system design can also make cars several-fold more efficient even before they're electrified, making their electrification faster and cheaper, and in this country alone saving trillions of dollars. Most of the energy needed to move a car is actually caused by its weight, and saving 1 unit of energy at the wheels by taking out weight or drag leverages 4 or 5 units of fuel saved in the tank. So the carbon fiber electric car I drive made money from the first unit off the assembly line 10 years ago, and all 250,000 units since. Its carbon fiber, you see, was paid for by needing fewer batteries to move less weight. And then fewer batteries recharge faster with less infrastructure investment and less energy. Integrative design compounds or snowballs saved weight far more than other automakers had assumed. Assembly is radically frugal. It eliminates the 2 hardest steps in automaking. It's much better for workers. And the quadrupled efficiency, equivalent to 124 miles a gallon, is uncompromised and brings many driver benefits, of which my favorite is it turns in half the normal radius. Really handy. The next game changer could be 2 hypercars from little firms I advise, both production ready, now raising the rest of their production capital. Most drivers will not need to recharge this American carbon fiber 2-seat 3-wheeler or this Dutch metal 5-seat 4-wheeler, because they're both about 3 times as efficient as a Tesla. So their topside solar cells capture enough energy for ordinary daily driving without plugging in, bypassing the charging infrastructure and its electricity supplies. And they can get even better. My team helped Walmart's fleet of heavy trucks, the world's biggest civilian fleet, to save half its fuel per case in a decade, including smarter logistics. But better technology alone can profitably make U.S. heavy trucks at least 3 times more efficient, as one maker expects to prove this year. And airplane efficiency, too, can rise 3 to 5-fold like these decade-old designs by Boeing, NASA, and MIT. Even today, Tesla's heavy truck more than triples efficiency with pure electric propulsion, 40% sleeker aerodynamics, lightweighting that offsets the battery weight, and about a 2-year payback against low U.S. diesel prices. It'll get even better. Then there's this flight-tested executive plane that could fly from Boston to Stockholm with 1/8 the operating cost and fuel use of a business jet before electrification, and it could probably scale up the technology to about 737 size. That could blow up everyone's aviation business models. And now there's a new kind of structure, a lattice of little plastic cells covered by polymer membrane that can make metal airplane structures like wings about 60 times lighter weight, but stronger and tougher. So if you add up these and many other savings, it looks like the oil and gas reserves unsellable for competitive reasons are bigger than the reserves unburnable for climate reasons. That is, oil owners are even more at risk from market competition than from climate regulation. For example, the cost of getting U.S. automobiles completely off oil has fallen from $18 per saved barrel a dozen years ago to somewhere around $0 to $7 a barrel today, and it's heading below 0 in the next few years. So oil has become uncompetitive even at low prices before it becomes unavailable even at high prices. With electricity, as with fuels worldwide, both technology and design are moving efficiency into fast forward. For example, prior lighting improvements got swept away as LEDs in a decade got 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, and 10 times cheaper. And as they save about 1/8 of the world's electricity, LEDs will pry open an old crack in the business model of electric utilities. You see, Thomas Edison didn't sell electricity, he sold light. He would charge you a penny to run a lamp for an hour, so that future lighting efficiency gains would cut his costs. But in 1892, utilities switched to selling kilowatt hours, so efficient use cuts their revenues. They're selling you a commodity But as a customer, you want an infrastructure or a service, not just electrons. What you want is services like hot shower and cold beer. Oil and gas companies use the same flawed business model. They sell you molecules, not the services you want, like comfort and mobility. In order to fix that, they're going to have to start selling or leasing services. So the less commodity is used, the more money you both make. Well, you might wonder what else changes this fast, like LEDs. Well, it's the rest of the energy transformation, modern renewables, because LEDs backwards are PVs, photovoltaics. Instead of turning electricity into light, they turn light into electricity. Solar and wind power costs have plunged below the dashed lines at the bottom. The cost of fossil fuels fed into thermal power plants in the U.S. So often our old coal and gas and nuclear plants have become uneconomic just to operate. You know, it's wise to sell customers what they want before someone else does. And electricity users are figuring out they can buy a lot fewer electrons, use them far more productively and timely, produce their own, even trade them with each other. Dutch customers can buy renewable electricity directly from other customers on this peer-to-peer website of Van de Bron, literally from the source. A friend of mine bought his electricity from the guy in the upper left photo because the price in magenta was pretty good, and it's a really cute piglet. And then he got a long handwritten Christmas card from his electricity supplier. You know, what monopoly utility can dream of such customer intimacy? Indeed, powerful disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. These 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't just add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves, they hunt in packs, they multiply quickly, and they can gobble up half of utility revenues in this decade. Together, they're creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most utility cultures can cope. 9 years ago, all central power plants were called dinosaurs, and the full quote is, "Too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run." Who do you suppose said that? It wasn't Greenpeace. It was Union Bank of Switzerland. And now there's a new wave of Pac-Men coming over the hill and more behind them. Renewable power's astounding progress is accelerating. For 82% of global power generation, as of some months ago, unsubsidized renewables, solar and yellow, wind and blue, have become the least cost source of new bulk electricity in the world. Bloomberg New Energy Finance found that the cheapest way to meet a flat load is now solar or wind power, plus backup, which can be efficient use, timely use, storage, renewables, or fueled. And while the costs are flat for fossil fuel power and rising for nuclear, they keep falling for renewables and storage. In fact, between last September and 5 weeks ago, Bloomberg raised its forecast of global solar power additions in this year by 44%. It's speeding up that dramatically. China alone is now expected to install 209 billion watts of solar power this year, almost twice what they did last year. Solar developers are investing over $1 billion a day, more than oil gets. The revolution already happened, sorry if you missed it. And renewables also scale up in a fundamentally different way. You know, traditionally utilities would build these giant cathedral-like power plants, each costing billions, taking many years to license and build. But now each year, with similar capital, you can build a factory that produces each year thereafter enough solar cells to generate each year thereafter as much electricity as your cathedral will ultimately make. So solar output worldwide is scaling faster than cell phones. You see that in the upper corners there, just after 10 years of this little experiment, solar is 15 times ahead in how much electricity it made. The big, slow, complex power plants can never catch up, so renewables are now around 90% of the world's net capacity additions. Let me show you a little surprising example of that on a smaller scale. At the end of 2018, coal-dependent Vietnam had 0.1 gigawatts, billion watts of solar power. 2 years later, it had 16.5 gigawatts, the most in East Asia, a third more than the target they'd set for 2025 just months earlier. And of that 16 gigawatts added, 9 was on 100,000 rooftops or similar structures. That's equivalent to building half the nation's coal plants in a year once the grid catches up. And of those additions, 72% were installed just in December, mostly in the last week of December. It sounds like they didn't get much sleep, but there was a 9-month window closing for a juicy feed-in tariff to sell solar power back to the grid. And if you have smart, resourceful, hardworking people, they can do remarkable things because there's so many of them, each doing a little bit. And it all adds up. There's a similar revolution emerging in China where rooftop solar was not a thing 6 years ago. 5 years later, there were 40% of total and 61% of new Chinese solar power. And last year, 1 in every 4 solar panels in the world was on a Chinese rooftop from a standing start. Wow. Now, all this means that we don't need speculative and probably very slow and costly technologies like nuclear fusion and fission, except, of course, the well-engineered and remotely sited free fusion reactor that's already thoughtfully provided. However, we should be glad that our neighborhood fusion reactor is 93 million miles away because sometimes it burps. Such solar flares will sooner or later destroy any unprotected power grid, as most still are. And their next peak, due in a couple of years, but now looking a year or two early, is expected to be one of the most intense ever. Against that threat and a lot of others, our best protection is a portfolio of efficiently used, diverse, dispersed, renewable, resilient power sources, the right size for the job, and especially the ones that are right on our roofs, not at the other end of a vast and brittle grid hauling power for hundreds of miles. And it should be wired to work with or without the grid, as my house does. That kind of resilient hookup ought to be our standard practice, so we can build resilience from the bottom up, one roof at a time. But notice that carbon-free power is necessary, but it is not sufficient. We also need cheap and fast. We need to count carbon and cost and speed, not just one or two of those. Actual market prices and deployment speeds mean that new nuclear plants would save many-fold less carbon per dollar and per year than cheaper, faster efficiency or modern renewables, so that it would actually end up making climate change worse. And just operating, let alone further subsidizing existing nuclear plants, wastes money that could buy cheaper options, saving even more carbon sooner. The more urgent you think climate change is, the more vital it is to buy cheap, fast, proven solutions rather than costly, slow, speculative ones. When someone tells you that climate change is so urgent that we need all of the above, and some official says, oh, we're buying all of the above, we are not picking and backing winners, remember the retort by Peter Bradford, the Dean of U.S. Utility Regulators. He rightly said, we're not picking and backing winners. They don't need it. We're picking and backing losers. That makes climate change worse. There are no proposed changes in size or technology or fuel cycle that could change these conclusions. They're simply intrinsic to all nuclear technologies. And global nuclear power adds each year as much supply as renewables add every roughly 4 days. A climate non-solution is not worth paying for, let alone extra. In short, nuclear power has no business case and no operational need. It offers no benefits for grid reliability or resilience that would justify special treatment. On the contrary, its inflexibility and ungraceful failures complicate modern grid operations. And yet we are still told that only coal, gas, and nuclear stations can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, while wind power and photovoltaics are variable and hence supposedly unreliable. But variable does not mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in a stormy winter month a decade ago forecast a day ahead the actual output of the country's wind farms. They would do well to forecast demand that accurately. And forecasting has since improved so much more that East Danish wind operators bid day-ahead wind power into the grid's hourly auction for balancing reserves just as confidently as they could bid fossil-fueled generators. Indeed, the reason we built the grid is that no generator is 24/7. They all break. And when a giant plant fails, you lose 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, often for weeks or months. So grids manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and by location. So in the hot and often humid state of Texas, whose grid has no big hydro dams and is only 1% connected to the rest of the country, a 2050 summer week of expected loads can get much smaller and less peaky with profitably efficient use. Then we can make 86% of the annual electricity with wind and solar cells. You see, they are indeed quite variable. And 14% from dispatchable renewables that you can run whenever you want to, like geothermal, small hydro, solar thermal electric, burning municipal and industrial and farm waste, burning biogas, burning obsolete energy studies. So now you've got 100% renewable energy supply, but it's not a great match to the load, the dashed line. So to match them up, you can put surplus electricity into two kinds of distributed savings that are worth buying anyway: ice storage, air conditioning, and smart charging of electric autos, and then recover that energy when needed and fill the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. So now you have 100% renewable electricity every hour of the year with no bulk storage and with only about 5% left over to help decarbonize other sectors. So the economics should be excellent even at today's prices. And indeed, some grid operators are doing such choreography today. Germany, Britain, Ireland, Lithuania are all half renewably powered. Denmark is well over 80%. Scotland close to 100, and already they and some other European countries with modest or no hydropower meet about half to 3/4 or more of their annual electric needs from renewables. And yet they're adding no bulk storage. They have superior and rising reliability for Denmark and Germany, 5 times ours. The 99.999% reliable former East German utility, 50 Hertz, was 65% renewably powered last year and targets 100% all reliably integrated in another 9 years. So as my colleague Clay Stranger says, the operators have learned to run these grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously creates beautiful music. Standard models say that we need giant fossil-fueled or nuclear capacity to keep the grid reliable as it becomes renewable, but that omits most of the grid balancing solutions. Their full competitive landscape, conceptually sketched here, includes 10 carbon-free ways to balance the grid across all timescales, not just big batteries in magenta and not needing fossil-fueled backup in red. Of course, your actual cost will vary, but bulk storage comes last, not first, because it's the costliest option. So we needn't wait for a storage miracle, although some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. The two boxes on the left, negawatts and flexawatts, are both about 3 times bigger than had been thought, yet cheaper, actually highly profitable. So giant batteries, the costliest option at the far right, are valuable and profitable, but they seldom look necessary. Thus, the ultra-reliable German grid operator I just mentioned has recently analyzed the dark doldrums in Europe, the so-called Dunkelflaute, that is often claimed to need months or seasons or years of electrical storage. But they included many of these grid balancing methods, and doing so reduced the backup need to at most a week or two per year, about 6% of winter generation. Not trivial, but readily managed. Electric vehicles, meanwhile, are now the majority of new 2- and 3-wheelers. They are about 15% of this year's global auto sales, heading for at least 2/3 by the end of the decade. Meanwhile, efficient and electric autos are morphing from PIGs, that is, personal internal combustion gasoline steel-dominated vehicles, to SEALs, shareable electric autonomous lightweight service vehicles. So that's 2 changes in technology and 3 in business model, all simultaneous, mutually reinforcing, vigorously in play, and supercharged by China and India with RMI's vigorous help. Now, assembling all these opportunities, our 2011 business and design book, Reinventing Fire, rigorously showed how to triple U.S. energy efficiency and quintuple renewables by 2050, needing then no oil or coal or nuclear energy, and at least 1/3 less natural gas, even less than that if you did it again now, while saving $5 trillion in net present value, growing the economy 2.6-fold, strengthening national security, and cutting fossil carbon emissions by 82 to 86%. Yet we found needing no new inventions and no acts of Congress, but with smart city and state policies led by business for profit. How are we doing? Well, so far the first 12 years of that 40-year journey are pretty well on track. Green actual versus blue proposed, I think largely because the private sector smells the $5 trillion on the table, and that is exactly what should be happening. These best buys are also the most effective solutions to big global problems that hazard every country's security and prosperity. And if you like any of Reinventing Fire's outcomes, you could support this transition without having to like every outcome or agree about which outcome is most important. So focusing on outcomes, not motives, can turn gridlock and conflict into a unifying solution to our common energy challenge. Simulated by those U.S. findings at the G20 7 years ago, China's National Development and Reform Commission published its roadmap for China's energy revolution, detailing how China can save over $3 trillion, run a 7-fold bigger economy in 2050 than 2010, while using today's energy 7 times more productively, emit 42% less carbon, burn 80% less coal, and get 13 times more GDP from each ton of fossil carbon. This roadmap strongly informed the 13th 5-year plan, whose energy authors happen to be our steering committee. The 14th plan strongly continues this line. So if you extrapolate those on-track U.S., adopted Chinese, and similar European findings to the other half of the world, you could get to a 2-degree climate target about $18 trillion cheaper than business as usual, and reinvesting then some of that in natural systems carbon removal could get us to 1.5 degrees, the Paris goal, with trillions of dollars left over, and huge progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Making climate protection not costly but profitable should also simplify the politics. And a powerful accelerator for getting all this done is capital market dynamics. Incumbent energy suppliers feeling the threat understandably focus on the need for price to exceed cost. But many seem to forget the other part of the business condition, that value must exceed price. If competitors offer a superior value proposition and run off with your revenues, it doesn't matter if you can profitably sell what your ex-customers are no longer buying. And these energy transformations can flip markets with breathtaking speed. On Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, In 1900, you would have to look hard for the first car. Anyone see it? Just 13 years later, you have to look even harder for the last horse. The horse and buggy industry thought it would have many decades to adapt, but Ford's Model T got 62% cheaper in 13 years. Car-owning households soared from 8 to about 60% in a decade, three-quarters financed by a GM and DuPont innovation called car loans. Today's solar modules just got 80% cheaper in 5 years. Three-quarters of our rooftop solar is innovatively financed. Ford's and Edison's industries are merging to eat Rockefeller's industry. Horse and buggy thinking is dangerous, but still common. As the late ex-oilman Murray Strong said, not all the fossils are in the fuel. But DuPont's ex-chairman Edgar Woolard reminds us that firms hampered by old thinking won't be a problem, he said, because they simply won't be around long term. So you see, the pace of transformation is set not by incumbents, but by insurgents, who are not inhibited by incumbents' business models or legacy assets or cultures. Moreover, investors flee before customers do, because capital markets keenly sniff out disruption, and once they think you're in or even headed for the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done before they decapitalize you and invest in your successors. Already, trillions of dollars have prudently fled the fossil fuel industries as they hemorrhage capital, talent, and political influence. Before Putin's war, the world's top 16 listed hydrocarbon companies combined were worth less than Apple, and all the world's significant automakers combined were worth less than Tesla. RMI's investment analyst Kingsmill Bond explains this brutal logic of the capital markets. He says any fast-growing challenger will rapidly take all the growth in a slow-growing market. As a rule of thumb, incumbent sales will peak when the challenger gets to around 3% market share, as in these historic examples. That was U.S. cars market share in 1910, when the sales of non-farm horses peaked, just like these 6 examples. And why is this happening? Well, because most investors don't just want size, they also want growth, and they try to sell just before sales peak, because then stagnation strands assets and competition drops prices. So that's why the coal industry lost 3/4 of its world and 99% of its U.S. market value. That collapsing value was spreading to oil and gas before Putin's war at the temporary price spike, and now it's resuming, so oil companies are having to devote half their windfall to bribing skittish investors to stay on board and hold their shares. Peak nuclear output, peak coal use, peak auto sales, peak fossil power have already happened. The International Energy Agency says the pandemic slump undid energy's previous 4 years of growth and CO2's previous 9 years of growth, but meanwhile renewables grew 45% faster. The first trillion watts of renewables took 15 years, the second 5 years, the third finished last year 3 years, the fourth finished in a few more months 2 years. As BP says, it's likely that peak oil happened already in 2019. Peak fossil fuels and peak CO2 emissions probably did too, subject to minor fluctuations due to anomalous weather or war. So we're bumping along this plateau for another few years, and then fossil fuel use, as you see at the far right, will enter an accelerating and terminal decline. So those 2 scenarios at the right are from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, but they're similarly framed by the International Energy Agency, BP, Shell, McKinsey, Rystad. And in the U.S., every energy-using sector has already passed peak fossil fuel. So this pattern of peak and plateau and decline for fossil fuels is actually global. Putin's war just sped the transition by blowing up the fossil fuel era that underlines Putin's power. Europe brought remarkable focus and resolve to getting off fossil fuels faster by speeding efficiency and renewables. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act triggered as much domestic clean energy supply chain investment in its first year as we'd seen in the previous 8 years. And now cost and climate and security imperatives, long claimed to be in conflict, are completely convergent. The experience of energy incumbents makes them perceive change as linear, but the new energy reality, the new normal, is exponential. That needs a new mindset and a lot more agility because it's hard to catch an exponential curve from behind. The U.S. does share in this rapid growth, but it dominates the old industries, not the new ones. It's not the technological epicenter of clean energy as it was for the internet. That honor goes to China, where far-sighted policies have built around half the world's renewable energy and even more of many of its supply chains. Happily, this transition is rapidly spreading across the world. Just think back. Just a decade ago, solar and wind power cost far more than fossil fuels, and many thought they'd never break 5% market share. Now they're half the price of fossil fuels, and they're providing over half the electricity in leading markets. They're going to go much higher than that. A decade ago, electric vehicles were very costly with few chargers and no giant battery factories. Now they cost no more to buy than gasoline cars in China, the world's biggest car market. Tesla's base Model 3 is priced $6,000 below the average new U.S. car, and that's before tax credits. 400 giant battery factories are being built, and there are 3 million public chargers. In this decade, solar power, which the International Energy Agency calls the cheapest energy source in history, will drop its price by another half. Electric autos are going to win on sticker price in every major market and segment, and hydrogen will cost less to make from sun and wind power than from fossil fuels, and that, in fact, that was already true in West China 2 years ago. The main uncertainty is only fast versus faster in this decade when winners emerge and infrastructure gets built. So together, efficient use, efficient power generation, and renewable supply are squeezing out fossil fuels. The 70-odd% of global energy still coming from fossil fuels is just as misleading a guide to the future as was the number of horses in 1900. Both are a stock whose leading indicator is flows. To understand where stocks are headed, follow the flows. Starting around 2019, renewables met all service growth, or all global growth in service demand. Starting last year or this year, they exceeded demand growth, so the squeeze is now on. One more thought. The energy transformation I've summarized is not just fundamental, it's elemental. The first industrial revolution was the age of carbon, creating our prosperity and the world's mightiest industries from coal and oil and gas. But now that obsolete age of carbon is giving way to the modern age of silicon. Silicon microchips, telecoms, software turn people from isolated to networked, systems from dumb to smart, grids from analog to digital, and potentially from dirigist to democratized. Silicon power electronics make electricity interconvertible and precisely applicable, replacing fiery molecules with obedient electrons. And silicon solar cells enable the ascent of energy from mining the fires of hell to harvesting the breath and radiance of heaven. So our responsibility and opportunity is to help enable the new energy system, not protect the old, to build back better, to move fast and fix things, so the global energy transformation can move at the pace and cost of design and software, not of infrastructure, and can be not constrained by the inertia of incumbents, but sped by the ambition of insurgents, perhaps some of you. I was asked to end with a little coda, some comments about why and how I've been doing this work for the past half-century. If hope seems scarce in these troubled times, well, that's a choice each of us gets to make, because as Joanna Macy reminds us, hope is not something you have, it's something you do. And if you do hope, then you could practice what I call applied hope. What's that? Let me give you a few excerpts from a recent commencement talk. The early pioneer Bill McClarney was stirring a vat of algae in his Costa Rica Research Center when a brassy North American lady strode in. What, she demanded, was he doing stirring a vat of green goo when what the world really needs is love? No, said Bill. There's theoretical love, and then there's applied love. He kept on stirring. Many of us here stir and strive in the spirit of applied hope. We work to make the world better, not from some airy theoretical hope, but in the pragmatic and grounded conviction that starting with hope and acting out of hope can cultivate a different kind of world worth being hopeful about, reinforcing itself in a virtuous spiral. Applied hope is not about some vague far-off future, but is expressed and created moment by moment through our choices. Francis Moore Lepay said, hope is a stance, not an assessment. But applied hope is not mere glandular optimism. The optimist treats the future as fate, not choice, and thus fails to take responsibility for making the world we want. Applied hope is a deliberate choice of heart and head. David Orr says the optimist has his feet up on the desk and a satisfied smirk knowing the deck is stacked. The person living in applied hope has her sleeves rolled up and is fighting hard to change or beat the odds. Optimism can easily mask cowardice. Applied hope requires fearlessness. To be sure, fear of specific and avoidable dangers has evolutionary value. Nobody has ancestors who are not mindful of saber-toothed tigers. But pervasive dread promoted by some who want to keep us pickled in fear is numbing and demotivating. You cannot depress people into action. Sometimes when I give a talk, a questioner will detail the many bad things happening in the world, all the suffering in the universe, and ask, how dare you propose solutions? Isn't resistance futile? The only response I've found is to ask, as gently as I can, I can see why you feel that way. Does feeling that way make you more effective? In a college class a few years ago, one young woman bemoaned so many global problems that she said she had lost all hope and couldn't imagine bringing a child into such a world. But discussion quickly revealed to both of us that she had not lost hope at all. She knew exactly where she'd left it. The most solid foundation for feeling better about the future is to improve it, tangibly, durably, reproducibly, scalably. So now is the time to be practitioners, not theorists, to be synthesis, not specialists, to do solutions, not problems, to do transformation, not incrementalism. My mentor, Edwin Land, said, don't undertake a project unless it is manifestly important and nearly impossible. It's time to shift our language and action, as my wife Judy says, from somebody should to I will. To do real work on real projects and to go to scale. As that early activist St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. In a world short of both hope and time, we need to practice Raymond Williams' truth that to be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. Hope becomes possible, practical, even profitable when the advanced resource efficiency revolution turns scarcity into plenitude. David White has a poem, Loaves and Fishes, capturing that goal thus. He wrote, "This is not the age of information. This is not the age of information. Forget the news and the radio and the blurred screen. This is the time of loaves and fishes. People are hungry, and one good word is bread for 1,000. So with the world so finely balanced between fear and hope, with the outcome in suspense and a whiff of imminent shift in the air, let us choose to add the small, stubborn ounces of our weight on the side of applied hope. As the late theologian Houston Smith's 15-year Zen master Koto Roshi put it, infinite gratitude toward all things past, infinite service to all things present, infinite responsibility to all things future. This mission is challenging. It requires you to combine sizzle in your brain, fire in your belly, perseverance rooted like a redwood, and soul as light as a butterfly. According to the internet, one Michael C. Muhammad said, "Everything works out right in the end. If things are not working right, it's not the end yet." Don't let it bother you. Relax and keep on going. Where could that path take us? Well, imagine a world where oil and gas and coal and nuclear energy have all been phased out, all vanquished by the efficiency of renewables, whose lower costs and lower risks have already enabled them to capture most of the world's market for new electrical services. Where integrated design has shrunk energy needs by several folds, perhaps many-fold, supporting a thriving world with less energy than today. Where resilient, right-sized energy systems make major failures impossible, not inevitable. Where the collapse of oil's demand and price has defunded enemies, undermined dictatorship and corruption, and doused the Mideast tinderbox. Where our advanced economy is no longer fueled at all by the rotted remains of primeval swamp goo and dinosaur poop. Where energy policy is no longer a gloomy multiple choice test. Do you prefer to die from A, climate change, B, oil wars, or C, nuclear holocaust? We choose D, none of the above. Imagine, therefore, a world where carbon emissions have long been steadily declining, at vast profit because saving fuel costs less than buying fuel, where global climate has stabilized and repair has begun, and where this planetary near-death experience has made antisocial and unacceptable the arrogance that let cleverness imperil the whole human prospect by outrunning wisdom. Imagine a world where the successful industries, rather than wasting 99.98% of their materials, follow Ray Anderson's lead. They take nothing, waste nothing, and do no harm. And do very well by doing good, at the expense not of the earth but of less alert competitors. Where the cost of waste is driving unnatural capitalism extinct. Where service providers and their customers prosper by doing more and better with less for longer, so products become ever more efficient to make and to use. Where integrative engineering and biomimicry create abundance by design, and where elegant frugality turns scarcities and conflicts about energy, water, land, minerals into enough for all, forever. Imagine a world where the war against the earth is over, where we've stopped treating soil like dirt, forests are expanding, farms emulate natural ecosystems, rivers run clean, oceans are starting to recover, fish and wildlife are returning, and a stabilizing, radically resource-efficient human population needs ever less of the world's land and metabolism, leaving more for all the relatives who give us life. Imagine a world secure, free from fear of privation or attack, where conflict prevention is as normal as fire prevention, where conflicts not avoided are peacefully resolved through strengthened international laws, norms, and institutions, where threatened aggression is reliably deterred or defeated by non-provocative defense that makes others feel and be more secure, not less, where all people can be nourished, healthy, and educated, and where all know Dr. King's truth, that peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. Imagine a world where reason, diversity, inclusion, tolerance, and democracy are once more ascendant, where economic and religious fundamentalism are obsolete, where tyranny is odious, rare, failing, and dwindling, and where global consciousness has transcended fear to live and strive in hope, in applied hope. Each of you can choose to be one of those unusual people who, with humor and courage, chutzpah and humility, eager enthusiasm and relentless patience, are composing their lives and combining their efforts to make it so. Here we are. And now imagine the power of all of us together to make it so. I want to reflect on those ideas. Here's where you'll find a longer version. Now that you know what applied hope is and some ways to do it, I'm curious to hear what you're going to do about it and what's on your minds. Thank you all for your good work and your kind and prolonged attention.